Warning, this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. I could smell it before I even saw it. Blood, fresh and thick, hung heavy in the air. The scent clung to everything, the damp earth, the festival banners swaying gently in the summer breeze, and the people strolling through the streets, oblivious to what was really happening. The town of Willow Creek was celebrating its annual meat festival, a tradition steeped in lore and heritage. This year, though, it wasn't just livestock on the chopping block, it was us. I hadn't meant to stay so late at the festival grounds, but the crowd, the music, and the buzz of conversation had kept me anchored in place. Something in me felt uneasy, an instinct deep down telling me to run and never look back. It wasn't the festival itself, it was who they had hired to run it this year, Mark the Butcher Harrison. An ex-convict, they said. Someone who'd spent time behind bars for things they brushed off as a misunderstanding, but I knew better. I had heard rumors, whispered tales of what really happened in the dark alleys and prison cells. Torture. Cannibalism. Mark was a predator who had somehow found a way back into society's graces, and now he stood behind the counters, carving thick slabs of meat that sizzled on grills and filled the air with a stomach-churning aroma. I wandered closer to his booth, half-dazed by the intoxicating mix of heat and smoke. His eyes caught mine, a glint of recognition in them. I froze. He smiled, a smile that stretched too wide, revealing teeth stained a sickly yellow. Care for a taste? He rasped, holding up a fork with a glistening morsel skewered on the end. I stared at the meat. It looked normal. Charred on the outside, glistening on the inside, just like any good cut should be. But something inside me screamed to run. I forced a weak smile and shook my head. Not today. Maybe later. He nodded, his gaze never leaving me as I backed away, feeling a chill run down my spine. I tore, pressing in around me, trapping me in a maze of faces and laughter. I pushed through them, heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat of dread. Then I saw it, a glimpse through a crack in the wooden fencing behind the butcher's booth. A cellar door. I don't know what possessed me to go there, maybe curiosity, maybe the gnawing fear that something was terribly wrong. I crept closer, glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one was watching, and slipped behind the booth. The cellar door was old, creaking as I pulled it open, releasing a gust of cold, damp air that reeked of rot. My stomach turned, but I pressed on, descending into the darkness. The steps creaked under my weight, and each one felt like a march toward something I didn't want to see. I reached the bottom and fumbled for a light switch, finding it with trembling fingers. The bulbs flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. It was a slaughterhouse. Hooks dangled from the ceiling, glistening with something thick and red. Steel tables lined the walls, covered with tools, knives, cleavers, saws, each one crusted with dried blood. My heart skipped a beat as my eyes landed on the far end of the room. There, on the table, was a body, or what was left of one. Skin peeled away, muscles exposed and glistening. The head was gone, replaced by a mass of ragged flesh. My knees buckled, and I stumbled back, retching. The butcher, Mark, he wasn't just killing livestock. He was butchering people, and we were eating it. My mind spun, horror flooding every corner of my consciousness. I had to get out, warn everyone. I turned to run back up the stairs, but a figure loomed at the top, blocking my path. Mark. His smile stretched impossibly wide, his eyes gleaming with manic delight. "You weren't supposed to see this," he crooned, his voice a deep, guttural whisper that sent looking for something, anything, to defend myself. My hand landed on a cleaver, slick with blood. I picked it up, holding it in front of me like a pathetic shield. "Oh, you think you can fight me?" He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed off the cellar walls. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "You're just meat." "And I am the butcher." I lunged at him, swinging the cleaver wildly. He sidestepped, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip and twisting it until I screamed, the cleaver clattering to the ground. He shoved me back, and I fell against one of the tables, gasping for breath, my vision blurring with pain and fear. He loomed over me, his breath hot and fetid on my face. "Now, let's not make this any messier than it needs to be," he whispered, pulling a long, serrated knife from his belt. I struggled, kicking out at him, but he was too strong. His hand clamped around my throat, squeezing, choking off my screams. I could feel the pressure building in my head, my vision narrowing to a tunnel of darkness. The knife came closer, its edge glinting in the dim light. Then I heard it, a noise from the stairs. A voice. "Mark. What are you doing?" It was Sheriff Daniels. Mark froze, his grip loosening just enough for me to gasp for air. He turned, his face twisting into a mask of fury. "Get out of here. Daniels. This has nothing to do with you." But it was too late. The sheriff was already descending the steps, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "What the hell?" He breathed, his hand going to his holster. "Mark, put the knife down." For a moment, everything hung in the balance. Mark stared at the sheriff, his eyes blazing with rage. Then, with a guttural roar, he lunged. The gunshot echoed through the cellar, deafening. Mark stumbled, a look of shock on his face as he crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around him. I gasped, knee to my feet. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight with fear and disbelief. I nodded, my throat too raw to speak. We staggered up the stairs, out into the blinding light of the festival grounds. People were still laughing, still eating, completely unaware of the horror that had been lurking beneath their feet. "We need to shut this down," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. He's been using people," the sheriff nodded grimly, his face pale. "I know. We'll handle it." But as I stood there, staring out at the cheerful crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The butcher may be dead, but the feast had already begun. And who knew how many had already taken their last, fateful bite? The nightmare should have ended. Mark the Butcher Harrison was dead, lying in a pool of his own blood. I should have felt relief as Sheriff Daniels and I stumbled out into the open air. But it wasn't over. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones, a cold, gnawing dread that whispered the horror had only just begun. The sheriff grabbed a nearby radio, his voice taut with urgency. "This is Daniels. I need all units at the festival grounds, now. We have a situation." Static crackled back, mingling with the festival's ambience, the laughter and music too loud, too oblivious to what we had just witnessed. My legs trembled, barely supporting my weight. The sight of people eating, oblivious to what they were consuming, made my stomach churn. They were biting into human flesh, and they had no idea. I wanted to scream, to rip the food from their hands, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The sheriff, catching my wild-eyed stare, gripped my shoulder. "I need you to stay with me. We'll stop this, I promise." I nodded, though doubt clouded my mind. We turned back toward the cellar, only to freeze at what we saw. The door, once standing ajar, was now shut tight. The dim light leaking through its chest. Did you close it?" "No," he muttered, drawing his gun, eyes narrowing. "Something's not right." We approached cautiously, the stench of rot seeping through the wood. My skin prickled with an unnatural chill, as if the cellar itself was alive, breathing, and hungry. The sheriff reached for the handle, but the door suddenly burst open, slamming him back. He crashed to the ground, his gun skidding away. My eyes widened in horror as a shadowy figure emerged, dragging something behind it. It was Mark. He stood in the doorway, drenched in blood, eyes glassy and vacant, yet filled with a malevolent rage. In his hand, he clutched a cleaver, its blade slick with fresh gore. I blinked, my brain scrambling to process the impossible. He had been shot. He was dead. But there he stood, mouth twitching into a twisted grin. Behind him, a lifeless, mutilated form lay crumpled on the cellar floor. I recognized the face. It was Sheriff Daniels. My breath hitched. I looked back at the sheriff sprawled on the ground before me, confusion and horror mixing in my gut. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. Who the hell are you? I screamed, backing away as the false sheriff's face contorted into a ghastly, leering smile. Mark stepped forward, raising the cleaver high. The feast must continue, he rasped, his voice a grotesque whisper. Like bones scraping against metal. I can't do it alone. The sheriff, or whatever he was, lunged at me, a feral glint in his eyes. I dodged, adrenaline kicking in, and scrambled for something to defend myself. My hand found a thick wooden pole from one of the festival tents. I gripped it tight, swinging wildly as the false sheriff came at me again. The pole struck him across the face with a sickening crunch, sending him staggering back. Mark laughed, a sound so guttural and inhuman it made my blood freeze. You can't kill what's already dead. Stay back. I screamed, thrusting the pole toward him. He grabbed it with ease, yanking it from my grasp and tossing it aside like a toy. My stomach dropped as I realized there was no reasoning, no escaping this. It was fight or die. The sheriff thing lunged again, and this time I ducked under his swing, darting toward the cellar door. If I could trap them inside. If I could, a meaty hand clamped onto my shoulder, yanking me back. I cried out as Mark swung the cleaver down. Pain erupted as the blade sliced across my arm, tearing through skin and muscle. I screamed, collapsing to the ground, clutching the wound. Hot blood seeped through my fingers, soaking the earth beneath me. Time to join the feast, Mark growled, looming over me, his eyes gleaming with savage delight. Panic surged. I reached blindly, my hand landing on a shard of glass from a shattered bottle nearby. I gripped it, swung up with all my might, and felt it sink into his thigh. Mark roared in agony, staggering back, giving me just enough space to scramble to my feet. My vision blurred with tears and blood loss, but I forced myself to run, every step a jolt of agony through my injured arm. I stumbled through the festival grounds, past laughing revelers and unaware families, toward the central plaza where the main festival fire burned. A desperate idea flashed through my mind. If the cellar was some kind of conduit for whatever evil had reanimated Mark, maybe fire could sever its hold. I darted toward the fire pit, grabbing a burning torch, ignoring the searing pain as heat licked at my skin. I turned, heart pounding, to see Mark and the false sheriff advancing, blood dripping from their mouths, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators savoring the hunt. Stop! I screamed, thrusting the torch out. Mark. His face twisted in an inhuman grin, eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The feast, he mouthed, though I could hear his voice clear as day in my mind, will never end. I gasped, the world spinning around me. The last thing I saw before blacking out was his silhouette, standing amidst the blaze, as if daring anyone to challenge him again. The butcher's feast had only begun. And the town of Willow Creek would never forget the taste of human horror. I woke to the sting of antiseptic and the shrill beep of a heart monitor. My body felt like it had been through a meat grinder, every muscle screaming with each shallow breath I took. I blinked against the fluorescent lights overhead, squinting as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. White walls, thin sheets, and the distant murmur of voices. The hospital. I turned my head, wincing as the motion sent bolts of pain down my injured arm. It was heavily bandaged, the white fabric already stained with patches of dried blood. A nurse in scrubs stood nearby, her face grim as she noticed me stirring. "You're awake," she said, her voice steady but laced with concern. "You're lucky to be alive. The sheriff told us what happened." "The fire," I struggled to speak, my mouth dry as sandpaper. Did they find him?" I managed to croak, my mind flashing back to Mark's silhouette in the flames. That twisted grin seared into my memory. The nurse exchanged a glance with a doctor who had just entered the room. They hesitated, a silence that made my skin crawl. Finally, the doctor spoke, his voice careful. "We found remains in the cellar. Unidentifiable due to the extent of the burns. But the sheriff believes it's over now." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "You don't understand. It's not over." I tried to sit up, my heart pounding with urgency, but the pain flared, and I fell back against the pitch, pushing me back down gently. "You've been through a lot." I wanted to scream, to warn them that this nightmare was far from finished, but my strength was gone. My eyelids grew heavy, and darkness tugged at the edges of my vision. The last thing I heard was the nurse's soft, soothing voice as she adjusted the sick strip. "Just rest. You're safe now." But I knew it was a lie. I don't know how long I slept. Hours, days, it all blended into a fog of feverish nightmares. I saw the cellar, the flames, Mark's face melting into a grotesque mask of rage. And always, that whisper in the back of my mind, "The feast will never end," when I finally woke again. It was to the sound of distant screaming. My heart skipped a beat, dread flooding my veins. I sat up, every nerve screaming in protest, but I forced myself to move. I yanked out the 4, ignoring the searing pain, and stumbled out of bed, legs shaky beneath me. The hallway outside my room was chaos. Patients and nurses ran past, eyes wide with terror. Blood smeared the linoleum floor, a thick trail leading around the corner. I forced myself to follow, dread gnawing at my insides with every step. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks, bile rising in my throat. A nurse lay sprawled on the floor, her torso split open, entrails glistening in the harsh fluorescent light. Beside her, a doctor, eyes gouged out, his mouth frozen in a silent scream, and standing over them, cleaver in hand, was Mark. I staggered back, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible. He should be dead. I'd seen him burn. But here he was, alive and grinning, his eyes glowing with a feral hunger. His clothes were charred and blackened, the stench of burnt flesh clinging to him. "You," he hissed, locking his gaze onto me. "I told you. The feast doesn't end." I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. Half forward. "Not when the hunger lives on. It's in the meat. It's in you." A wave of nausea hit me as his words sank in. The meat. The festival. The eating. How many people in the town had consumed the tainted flesh, unknowingly inviting whatever darkness lived in Mark into themselves? A curse spreading like a disease, Mark lunged at me, swinging the cleaver in a wild arc. I ducked, feeling the rush of air as the blade whistled past my head. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to get out of here. Had to find a way to stop this once and for all. I turned and bolted down the hallway, ignoring the searing pain in my arm. I could hear Mark's heavy footsteps behind me, his breaths ragged and animalistic. I burst through a set of double doors, finding myself in the hospital's main lobby. It was a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay scattered, torn open, limbs hacked off, the air thick with the coppery stench of blood. Nurses, patients, visitors, all butchered like livestock. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep moving. There had to be a way out. An exit. Something. I spotted the stairwell door to my left and sprinted toward it, slamming into it with my shoulder and nearly tumbling down the stairs in my haste. I took the stairs 2 at a time, heart pounding against my ribs. Mark's footsteps echoed behind me, relentless and inhumanly fast. I burst through the door at the bottom, emerging into the hospital's basement. Darkness greeted me, the only light coming from a flickering bulb above. I fumbled for the light switch, fingers trembling. When the overhead lights flickered to life, my blood ran cold. The basement was filled with makeshift tables and hooks dangling from the ceiling, just like in the cellar at the festival. And lining the walls, racks of meat, human limbs, torsos, heads. Mark stood in the doorway, his eyes gleaming with that unholy hunger. "Welcome to the real feast," he rasped, raising his cleaver high. "You'll make a fine addition to the menu." I glanced around frantically, searching for something to defend myself with. My eyes landed on a fire axe mounted on the wall. I lunged for it, yanking it free just as Mark charged at me, cleaver gleaming. I swung the axe with all my strength, feeling it connect with a sickening thunk. Mark staggered back, blood spraying from the deep gash in his chest, but he didn't fall. He grinned, blood dripping from his lips. "It'll take more than that." Desperation surged through me. I had to find a way to end this, to destroy whatever unholy force was keeping him alive. My eyes darted around the room, landing on a massive industrial meat grinder in the corner. An idea flashed through my mind, gruesome and insane. But it was the only shot I had. "Come and get me, you sick bastard." I screamed, backing toward the grinder, waving the axe in front of me. Mark lunged, cleaver raised. I sidestepped at the last second, swinging the axe down onto his leg. He howled, crumpling to the ground, and I seized my chance. I grabbed him by the shoulders, dragging him toward the grinder. He thrashed and snarled, clawing at me with inhuman strength, but I pushed forward, adrenaline and terror fueling my movements. I shoved him onto the lip of the grinder, straining with all my might to force his head toward the spinning blades. "No!" he shrieked, eyes wide with fury and fear. "You can't." The rest of his words were cut off as the grinder roared to life, the sound of metal on bone filling the air. Blood sprayed, hot and sticky, as Mark's body convulsed, the grinder chewing covered in blood, as his screams were drowned out by the whirring of the machine. It felt like hours, but finally, there was silence. The grinder came to a halt, leaving behind nothing but a wet, pulpy mess where Mark had been. I collapsed to my knees, trembling, staring at the remains. Was it over? Had I truly ended him? I wanted to believe it, but deep down, the dread lingered, because somewhere, out there, the townspeople had eaten. And the hunger, it spread, the butcher was gone. But his feast would never end. I didn't remember how I made it out of the hospital. The details blurred into a haze of blood, screams, and the constant drum of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the distant wail of sirens. I staggered forward, every muscle in my body trembling, every nerve screaming for rest. I couldn't stop moving. Not now. Not when the nightmare was still breathing down my neck. The town of Willow Creek was a ghost of itself. Houses lined the streets, their windows dark and empty, shutters drawn tight as if to ward off the horrors lurking outside. The smell of smoke hung in the air, mingling with the lingering scent of death. I had no destination in mind, just needed to keep moving. Survive. My arm throbbed, the bandages soaked through with fresh blood, leaving a trail behind me like a breadcrumb path of suffering. A part of me wanted to just collapse, to let the darkness take me. But the hunger. It whispered at the edges of my mind, clawing for a way in. I couldn't give in. I had to fight. I stumbled into the town square, the site of the feast, where tables still stood, now abandoned and draped in half-eaten platters. The tents flapped in the wind, empty and ominous. I glanced around, searching for any sign of life, any hint of the nightmare returning. All or I didn't even know what. Answers. Closure. Some sign that Mark was truly gone. But as I approached the center, the blood-soaked ground caught my eye. There, in the middle of the square, was the festival centerpiece, a large, metal cauldron, its contents charred and unrecognizable. I circled it, my heart pounding faster with each step. My reflection rippled on the surface of the cauldron, my face pale and smeared with dried blood. I stared at myself, at the wide, haunted eyes that stared back. Was this who I was now? A survivor? Or just the next course in Mark's twisted feast? Suddenly, a rustling sound cut through the silence. Like the shuffle of feet across gravel. I spun around, every muscle tensing, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The square was empty. No movement, no figures hiding in the shadows. But the sound came again, closer this time, scraping, dragging. Who's there? I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Show yourself. A flicker of motion from the corner of my eye. I turned, adrenaline surging, and caught sight of it, a shadow shifting between the tents. I stumbled back, raising my hands in a futile attempt to defend myself. You can't hide from it, a voice hissed, echoing through the square. It wasn't Mark's voice, but something more guttural, more primal. As if it came from the earth itself. The shadows twisted, converging at the edge of the square, taking form, and then, it stepped out into the light. Not Mark. Not the sheriff. But something worse. It looked like a man, but its skin was ashen, eyes hollow pits that bore into me. It dragged behind it a sack, bulging with the unmistakable shape of limbs, heads, torsos. I felt my stomach lurch, bile rising in my throat. The feast continues, it rasped. No, I breathed, shaking my... No, I stopped it. I killed him. The figure tilted its head, its lips curling into a grotesque semblance of a smile. Did you? Or did you just give the hunger a new face? My skin prickled with cold terror as I realized what it meant. Mark was gone, yes, but the hunger had survived. It had moved on, found a new host. Was it in me now? A sharp pang of hunger twisted my stomach, and I gasped, doubling over. No, no. I cried out, clutching my sides, trying to hold back the darkness clawing at my insides. I looked up at the figure, its form wavering, eyes gleaming with malevolent joy. You ate, didn't you? It purred, its voice a dark caress against my ears. You tasted the meat. I froze, memories flashing back, of the festival, the food, the laughter. I hadn't realized then, hadn't known what I was consuming. But I had eaten. Just a bite, but it was enough. It's in you now, it continued, stepping closer, dragging the sack behind it. The hunger. The feast. You can't escape it. You can't deny it. My mind raced, desperate for a way out. There had to be something I could do, some way to purge this evil from me. I turned, eyes landing on the smoldering remains of the festival fire pit, embers glowing faintly in the darkness. Fire. That's how I ended it before. Maybe. I sprinted to the fire pit, grabbing a half-burned torch, thrusting it into the embers. The wood caught quickly, flames licking up the length of the stick. I turned back to the figure, holding the torch high. You won't take me, I hissed, teeth bared. "I'll burn this whole town if I have to. I won't let you win." The figure paused, eyes glinting in the torchlight. And then it laughed. A deep, throaty laugh that reverberated through arms wide. "But the hunger won't die with the flames. It's in you, in them, in every bite they've taken. You can't cleanse what you are." I shook my head, raising the torch higher, determination and madness battling within me. "I'll find a way. I'll end this." The figure grinned wider, the shadows swirling around it. "You'll try. But the hunger, the feast, is eternal." I staggered back, clutching the torch, staring at the figure, at the sack it had dragged with it. I could hear whispers now, growing louder, filling my head with a cacophony of voices urging me to eat, to feast, to become one with the hunger. My mouth watered, stomach twisting with an unnatural craving. "No," I grunted, fighting against the tide threatening to pull me under. "I'm not. I won't." The figure watched, its eyes boring into mine, and in that moment, I saw a glimmer of pity. "You'll see," it whispered, stepping back into the shadows, the sack slithering behind it like a serpent. "The feast will call you. And when it does, you'll come." I stood there, torch in hand, heart pounding, staring at the darkness where the figure had disappeared. My breath came in ragged gasps, the firelight dancing around me. I was alone now, but not truly. I could feel the hunger inside me, festering, waiting. I closed my eyes, gripping the torch so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had to find a way to end this. To end myself if that's what it took. I couldn't let the hunger win. Not again, but as I opened my eyes, staring into the silent, abandoned square, the realization struck me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't over. It would never be over, and somewhere in the darkness, I swore I heard Mark's voice whispering, "The feast never ends." With a shudder, I turned, walking into the night, the torch's flame flickering in my hand. I didn't know where I was going or how I would stop this. But one thing was certain, the feast was far from over.